And what's up, guys? Welcome to another home theater hangout with yours truly. And we have guest today, Mr. Kris Deering from Deep Dive AV. What's going on, Kris?
How's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, always fun having you on talking about projectors, projector screens, which today's topic will be projector screens. But I wanted to kick this off with a topic that we were just speaking about and something that I didn't know about, which is very surprising to me. So some of you guys know that I've been going through a bunch of projector reviews lately. I've gotten a lot of little ones. I think I did the Hisense C2s yesterday. All three of them. They're C2, C2 Pro, C2 Ultra. Come to find out, they just released their C3, like in China. So it's like, man, I just got the C2s in. So I did that. I have an Anchor one coming out next week. And I just did the Epson QL 7000, their big boy projector, which is 10,000 lumens, absolutely eye-blinding. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And I have been reviewing the JVC NZ900, which is their flagship. So one thing that I had mentioned to Kris is that every time I would turn on the projector, it's always a little bit blurry. And you guys know sometimes I wear glasses in my videos. I don't have the best eyesight. So every time I would turn it on, it would always look a little bit soft to me. So I'd always have to refocus it. So I thought maybe my projector was defective. But come to find out that no, this is like a normal occurrence for these high-end projectors with like 15 elements. Kris, I want you to explain what that means. What is 15 elements? Why is it that you have to wait for these really expensive projectors to catch focus after a certain period of time?
Yeah, so this is one of the trade-offs, I guess, with projector versus self-emissive displays, like a flat panel LCD, OLED, or anything else. Now, obviously, in those cases, the pixel itself is what's emitting the light, so you're not seeing anything that's like reflected light or anything. So they're just they're just putting out. So you basically always have perfect focus, right? I mean, there's resolution limitations, bit depth resolution, stuff like that, but there's no glass element that's focusing, right? So on a JVC, Sony, Epson, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's just generic across projectors, right? So all these different projectors have different size lenses. So in your case with the NZ900, I can't remember right off the top of my head. Oh, it's 16 group 100 millimeter all glass lens, right? So 16 optical groups inside there. And each of those groups is doing different things. Maybe it's for this color, that color, whatever. I'm not really a lens guy, but obviously, from if you think of the lens, like the JVC lens, if I was to hold it here in front of me, let's say it's like this big. Okay, on like one of those like Hisense ultra short throws, that lens could probably, like be tiny, like maybe like this size, right? Like maybe about the size of this or something like that. And I mean, some of them, the ones that you see like on like something like a Valerian or whatever, might even be something as small as this, as opposed to, like these a lot bigger lenses, right? So when you turn the projector on, the heat, so like that lens is going to change properties over time due to heat. There's heat going into it from light. That light is coming out of the light engine of the projector. So as that light, as you turn it on, the heat inside the projector is getting more and more, and then it's getting into the lens. So over time, those elements are warming up one after another at different rates. So the ones closer to the projector are warming up faster than the final element at the end of the lens. So as those warm up unequally, your focus is changing over time. So most guidelines would tell you, like, if you want to focus a projector properly for like its absolute best possible focus, you'd probably want to wait 45 to maybe 45 minutes to an hour is probably a safe bet. So like if I come to your house and I calibrate a projector, part of that is, doing alignment, focus, and things like that. I don't do any of that until the end. I mean, I make sure that it's within rough focus or whatever, but I don't do a final focus until the end, because by that time I've probably been at your house for 2 hours, 3 hours, or whatever. There's no way that projector isn't fully, that lens hasn't equalized out across all elements. So now I can give you the best focus that it can possible. But if I was demonstrating the projector or something like that, or you were just, hey, when I watch my projector, I want to make sure that it's in like its best possible operating condition, you would probably want to turn on the room and let it warm up before you're going to watch. So as I mentioned when you and I talked, in my personal case, I don't, if I'm going to watch something and I want to be at all critical, or I just know I want the best presentation of it possible, I turn on, my system from my phone or whatever and make sure that it's warming up. And I usually don't start watching anything until about half an hour, 45 minutes later than that. And even then, I'm going to get a little bit, but, at some point, how much of it you're going to notice, it's hard to say. Like you could just sit there and time it out for yourself. But yeah, but that's what it is. And obviously the smaller the lens, the less time it takes. But in your case, you got one with a big lens. So like if you had like a big Barco or something with a, the lens that's the size of a JVC projector, then that might even be even different in that case as well.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. So I haven't noticed that with the, I was going to say when I had the NZ8, I didn't notice that. But then again, the lens is definitely bigger on the 900.
Yeah, smaller lens. Still a decent size all glass lens, but, again, it just, and again, like each lens might be different in how much of a transition. Like I've had, I think now, let's see that I had the 4500, the NX9, the NZ9, the 25 LTD, and the NZ900. So I've had 5 projectors that have that lens that you have right now. And I've definitely noticed that some of them, the difference between startup and later was, more or less, depending on which model I had, so there's always going to be some kind of sample variance in there. So, it'd just be a matter of like, testing out the theory yourself, like bring up a desktop with like really small text or whatever, turn it on, maybe leave the room. So you're not just sitting there watching it slowly, come back in 10 minutes, and then be like, okay, how much did it focus? Like, what you would want to do, I guess, is the day before, like wait an hour, get a really good tight focus where you're like, that's where I want it, spot on. Had the projector on for an hour, did it. Then the next day, turn it on with something with like small text, and then check it right when you open it. Then check it maybe like every 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever you want. And then find out like, okay, from 15 minutes on, I couldn't tell a difference at all. So that's probably how much warm up you need before you're going to watch anything if you want to be critical about it.
Gosh. Okay. So man,
it's the prices you pay, man. You could just go self-emissive, but then you can't go the same screen size unless you're talking like micro LED, and then that has its own set of issues like noise and heat and electricity and blah blah blah. The list goes on. Gaps.
All right. So would you recommend having presets for like the first, 15 minutes or whatever?
It would just depend on how critical you are about what you watch and how much it really bothers you and stuff like that. And again, like what your sample looks like. It's just never really been a problem for me because again, I'm not, like the odds of me just turning on my system, sitting down and watching it, it usually doesn't happen. But mine's not so bad when I turn it on that it's like something where I'm like, again, like if I was doing a demo or I'm watching something like, let's say I was reviewing like I was before, that would be different. But if I'm just watching if I'm just going up there to watch a YouTube video or something like that, I don't really care. It's not so bad. But as I mentioned, I had a client, that's local to here. He used to be on the forums a lot. He noticed this with his, I think it was an NZ9 that he had, but where he set up different projector lens memories that were based on the amount of time that was on. I think he even automated it so it like turned over and stuff like that. But he uses his projector a lot for PC work. So, he would literally start up on a desktop, and obviously desktop graphics are a lot more demanding than, just throwing on a movie or something along those lines, because obviously motion resolution and all those things. But desktop, a desktop is always going to be like one of the things that's going to set apart focus more than anything else. Like, so it really depends on what you're watching.
Yeah, because sometimes I'll just, if I got a movie on Kaleidoscape and I'm like, oh, I got to do a review, I'll just pop it on and start watching. And sometimes, if I'm looking for like detail, I'm just like, oh, it's a little soft. I was like, oh, that's weird. I was like, they must be going for a certain look. Then I'd be like, let me just check really quick. I was like, okay, the focus is off.
Yeah.
Or if I switch on my Apple TV, I was like, why are the menus blurry? Like, God, like, come on, dude.
Yeah, but see, again, like that could bring on an entirely another topic, of stuff of like, okay, is the root problem the focus of the projector or the technology of the projector? Some people talk about like, well, this technology is sharper than that technology, but there's more that goes into that. Like, pixel fill versus non-pixel fill, how much, things like that are going to make an image smoother versus, more digital, which some people associate
Yeah.
with being sharper. And then the things that you watch. So if you're watching something like, a streaming box or something, are the graphics being generated at, the resolution that's the same? We assume they are, but are they? I don't know. And then, if you're watching a movie, I mean, I could easily have you over right now and be like, I could pick the content where you'd be like, wow, Chris's system's not very like focused. It's not very sharp. Like maybe I don't like projectors. But then I could pick five other things to watch where you'd be like, holy crap, this looks like a flat panel the whole time. Because again, like
Yeah.
stylistic choices of what lenses they use, what the capture medium was, all kinds of things. So I find that more than often, the sharpness of what we watch is dictated more by what we're watching. At least now, like most projectors, again, if they're set up properly and everything else, I find, at least personally, the limit has more to do with the content than the projector itself.
Yeah.
Again, there's always exceptions to the rule, but like,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So, future purchasers of NZ900s or anything really
Anything with a big
pricey
lens.
giant lenses.
Yeah.
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 Let those suckers warm up.
Yeah.
But let's go on to our next topic today: how to choose a projector screen. This comes up a lot in some of my projector reviews. Like, hey, is this going to look good with this screen? What kind of screen should I get? You've got the wrong screen for your room, Shane. You should have an ALR screen in your dedicated 100% blacked out room if you want to get the best. I'm like, come on, guys. I was like, why would I put an ALR screen in my theater room? But let's talk about ALR screens. Like, what is the main use case scenario for an ALR screen? Why would I go with an ALR screen? I know there's several kinds of ALR screens.
Yeah. So, hold on a second. Let me grab some little things here.
Yeah.
All right. So what is that? Yeah, that's a good one. All right. So, ALR stands for ambient light rejection, and I feel like this is one of those things where I'd be like, well, what do I need an ALR screen for, Kris? And I'd be like, for ambient light rejection. But yeah, I mean, the name says it all, right? So, the whole point of an ALR screen is to limit the amount of light from the room itself that's causing pollution to the image that you're seeing. So again, we're talking about projectors. Projectors are a reflective display system. So we have light that's coming from a projector that is now reflecting off of a screen in front of you, and that light's coming back, and that's what we perceive as the image. The screen itself is not generating its own light. So it's funny, as I've had conversations about this just recently, and a long time ago I got into I don't remember, it was like a debate or back and forth with another person that was a so-called industry expert, and he was talking about exactly what you said, like, oh, you really should have an ambient light rejecting screen in a room that's totally light controlled. And the reason he said is like, so here's one right here. So this is a Stewart Firehawk G5. So this is one of their most popular ambient light. Now I have this in like a foil or whatever. So here, let me take it out of the foil so you're not seeing all this reflection. But so this is the material, right? So you can see it's pretty dark. If I compared this to a Studio Tech 130, another really popular one, here's one that's white. So that's a Studio Tech 130, and here's a Firehawk, right? So, in here with the light that I have on it, you can see this one's like kind of dark gray, this one's white. So the argument was made that it's like, well, you can get blacker blacks with your ambient light rejection screen and stuff because, I mean, look at it. It's dark gray, right?
Yeah.
Your black is better. You can't do that with white because white can't be black. So, well, let's think about that. Like, the screen does not generate its own light. So if I go into my theater room right now and, like my room is 100% light controlled. If I turn off all the lights and I just go into the room, I have nothing on in there, and I sit in that room, I could sit there for 5 minutes, 5 hours. At no point will I ever see my screen. It is black. I can't see anything. I can do this with my hand all day, all day long, and I can't see a thing because the screen doesn't generate any light. So it doesn't matter that it's white or if it's black. It's if there's no light hitting it, then it will put out whatever the room is capable of putting out.
Yeah.
Right. So there is no benefit in terms of one being darker and one being lighter in terms of the black floor that it can do theoretically. You're limited to what the projector can do for black, and then you're limited to what the room will allow you to do because of the room floor. So you could think of it as a noise floor of the room or something like that. So what an ALR screen does is it allows you to artificially, somewhat, lower the noise floor of the room. So if I have a projector system in a room that has maybe some ambient light, or a lot of reflective surfaces where I go into tons of rooms where I calibrate and they have, a projector in the room, but they're like, well, my wife wouldn't let me paint the room. So it's like the color of like these walls behind me. Well, you have all kinds of light being scattered in that room. So it's coming from the projector, it's hitting the screen, and then it's going back into the room, bouncing all around, and then coming back at the screen. So now the screen is not only getting the light directly from the projector, it's also getting all of that scattered light back up there as well. It's kind of like off axis of a speaker. You don't want, at a certain point, that's a bad thing, right? So what an ambient light rejecting screen does is that they usually use some kind of coatings or things like that make it where the screen is effectively really good at reflecting light back at a certain angle that is coming at it, and then it comes right back at you. But it's really good at rejecting light that's coming from any other angle. And some of them are so sensitive to the angle that you're projecting onto it that you have to be really careful about what angle your projector is in relation to the screen. So your your lens shift or anything, like how high above the screen it is or whatever, and then where your head is in relation to the other angle. Because again, if you think about it, if it's trying to reject certain angles, you could be at an angle shooting at it, and then your angle of incident, angle of reflection back at you is then also in a part where you're not really in an optimized thing. There's also been really high gain screens that do the opposite, where they're trying to make it really bright. So Daylight used to have the high power screens, where those you had to be within a certain amount, your head had to be at a certain angle, a certain amount of distance from the height of the lens, so that you're in the cone of reflection, so that, let's say they rated it as a 2.8 gain screen, but in reality, depending on how you had it set up, it could only be a 1.2, because again, the angles wouldn't work. So these are really trying to just basically eliminate the light that the room is bringing to the scenario because of, the fact that you're not controlling the light in the room. It does help a little bit with lights that say you got an LED or something like that, but it's really designed more to combat the light that's reflecting around the room from the screen itself, which is going to affect your mixed contrast on image. So, it's not going to affect your white or your black. A lot of people say if you really want to have the best black possible, you have to have, no light in the room, or you have to have black walls and stuff like that. But if you have a projector that's putting out pure white and you measure it, and then you just put out pure black, there's nothing really to reflect back at the screen. So it doesn't affect the full on, full off contrast. But as soon as you have mixed images now that have let's say half black and half white, you have enough light now reflecting in that it's going to create a wash effect on the darker images. And that's really easy to see. Just if you're watching something, just start slowly turning on your lights if you have a dimmer, and you'll see how it's affecting the image, because now there's light coming back onto the screen that's not from the projector. Your room is effectively doing that. It's bouncing it all back. So this gets into another thing that a lot of times when I do presentations for dealers and stuff, I talk about. One of the things I see a lot when people are talking about screens, and again, contrast, because again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is preserve the image contrast, right? Is the popular notion of the black around the screen. You see this in forums all the time where it's like, hey, check out my room, and they have a screen up there, and then they have the entire front wall with black around it. So, some kind of velvet fabric or whatever. And then, or they'll have it where it's like, it's black on the front wall, but it's only black for 4 feet out or something like that. Because again, they didn't want to do the whole room in black. Well, the problem there is if you're talking about the black around the screen, it's doing absolutely nothing for image quality, because again, there's no light reflecting off that. It's reflecting off the screen. So the only thing that having black around your screen like that does is it creates basically a show box for your screen. So it makes it where, maybe there's nothing else on the screen around it that would key your eye away from the image. It's like a floating image, I guess is how I'd put it. You don't have anything that distracts you because you're like, oh, I keep seeing that thing over there or up there or whatever. So it frames the image, essentially. But in terms of contrast perception, it works against you. And the reason I say that is because our eyes are an amazing optical comparator. We're really good at looking at something and comparing one thing to another. So if you're doing that and you have a projector that doesn't have a very good black floor, which, most don't, and your blacks are weak, well, I mean, we can even take what we're looking at now. So like right now you have me kind of zoomed, where I can see you over here, on this side of me, but you see how we have like all this black around us? Well, imagine that this is our screen that we're looking at right now, and that black is the black velvet, or whatever that you have around your screen. If we were to put up, again, we're just assuming we're in a theater room right now, and let's say you have like an Epson. So the Epson has a black floor that's, it's not bad, but it's not great, right? Well, whenever you bring up that black, you now have all this black that's perfect black around your screen for your eyes to compare that black to. So now your black looks worse than it would look like if you had like a medium gray or something around the screen to compare it to. Because, the lighter the color around your black, the more our eyes perceive it as black, because we're comparing that to that. So in a lot of ways, it actually works against you to have the black around the screen. Now, if you were trying to improve your on-screen contrast, which, is what you should be doing if you're trying to, maximize your display, you would have black velvet or whatever on your back wall, and then, probably the side walls and stuff like that. So if you're looking at trying to improve the image on screen, you would really want the whole room, because again, that it would absorb all the light that's reflecting. So the only light on the screen is what's coming from the projector, hopefully, or to a certain extent. But, think about, again, the how reflection works, right? So angle of incident, angle of reflection. So if you're projecting onto a screen and it's going back, the one that's going to come back to the screen the fastest is from your back wall, because it's going back that way. Your side walls are going to go, at an angle and then go back to an angle, which is probably going to hit the back wall and then come back again, and things like that. Now, there are distractions of you get that, the reflection that you see on your ceiling where it's lit up right there and stuff. And again, getting rid of that really helps, because again, it's something that keys your eye away from the screen, but it might not be helping as much as, treating a certain other surface. Now, again, treating that makes it where the reflection is less to that and stuff like that. But again, you got to think about what wall is going to help you the most in terms of preserving the image aspect. I mean, the image contrast. And that's what an ALR screen is doing. So it's saying hey, I can't do all that, but is there a way I can try to reject a lot of that scattered lights hitting back? And you could do that, but this will only reject the light that's coming from certain angles and stuff like that. So it's not perfect. And there's one this is Stewart's, the Firehawk. This one's a really popular, the Black Diamond from SI. Yeah. There's a bunch of other ones that are like that. The problem with a lot of these, though, is when you actually use them, because of the coatings that they use, they might have stuff where it's you really notice a speckle or a sheen to them because of the coating that's used, and now that becomes a visual distraction from the purity of the image, because now it's imparting a signature onto that image. The other thing with these is that because they're, again, so trying to focus the light in a very specific way, you get what's called hot spotting, where the center of the image looks really, really bright, but as you go away from the center, the fall off is really hard. So
Yeah.
then it starts to look uneven in terms of uniformity and stuff like that. Um, you know,
So I
and
hear usually in my videos I get a lot of folks that are like, "Hey man, Shane, how's the speckle on this? How's the speckle on it?" Like I have just a 1.0 gain screen, or I think it's 1.1 from SI. I've never seen speckle, so I have no idea what these people are talking about. So
so it's an
is it from the
interchangeable
screen
word.
or
It's an
yeah?
interchangeable kind of word. So again, like everybody uses different things like sheen, like some kind of impartness. So there can be stuff from the screen itself. So like if you had a Lamberian surface like a Studio Tech 100, like that's like the industry standard screen. Now, when I say the industry standard screen, like that's what they would use in like maybe a mastering room, but a mastering room is like an absolute controlled environment. So like I could get away with that in my room because my room is insanely dark. Like I've gone to degrees where like having being a calibrator, I've been in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rooms. My room represents like what the 1% or less. Okay, so a Studio Tech 100 in my room would be fantastic because again, like I'm controlling all the light. But if you have any kind of reflective surfaces and stuff, it has zero rejection of anything. So it's like the worst. It can become the worst for a room like, let's say, like the room I'm in right now. It would be awful. And I've been in rooms that are exactly like this room that have a Studio Tech 100 because they were told it's the best screen, and it's like, oh my god, this is the worst screen for this room. It's a great screen, but like the worst one. So it's the tool for the job, right? Now, speckle, usually when people talk about speckle, they're talking about 3 RGB laser projectors because each of those has a different laser with a different wavelength from each other. And so you get these things where certain screens will make it where it looks like I always have trouble like trying to find something that's like what that looks like. The closest thing that I can think of is if you have like an iPhone or a cell phone and you have your screen and like let's say there's like a little bit of oil on your finger and you happen to like just touch it, and then when you're looking at the screen you'll see that it looks like this like dot crawl or something from that oil that got on there. It also has like a kind of a weird look to it, doesn't have that clean look to it. Laser speckle will look like that. Now, the higher the gain that you have, the more obvious it is. So when we did that projector comparison that I was just out in, we used Studio Tech 100 screens, and a lot of the reason it honestly wasn't the best screen for that room, but a lot of the reason we did that was because in the comparison we used a Valerian a Pro 2 projector, and it's a 3 RGB that can have speckle. So what would happen is if we had used like a Studio Tech 130, which I think would have been probably the best screen to use for the comparison itself, people might have been sensitive to the speckle, which would be, then you'd have to explain it. It's like, well, the speckle's there because of this. This is something you have to take into account if you're buying this projector, but it's being emphasized by the material that we're using. So, in your case with a 1.1 gain screen and the fact that you might be, evaluating some of these RGB laser projectors that they're not going through something else. They're literally, like you're getting the red, the green, the blue. It's not going through a phosphor or things like that. You might start to see speckle. Some screens have done stuff where they have like a vibration unit. I think in pro applications, sometimes they have a screen where it vibrates slightly and that diminishes the effect of that. But I imagine that also diminishes some of your resolution because now, it's just like there's always little trade-offs for everything. There's never any free lunch. But that's probably what they're talking about. And again, it would probably look like a sheen. You would probably see it mostly with bright areas that have like certain types of motion and stuff. So like a sheen on a projector screen, like Studio Tech 130 is what I use, their newer G4. If I have something that's like really bright white and there's a vertical pan, I tend to notice where it looks like there's a texture there that's not moving in relation to the other. So you start seeing like this, it looks like a kind of like a texture to it, where Studio Tech 100 really wouldn't have that. Now, Studio Tech 100 still has a coating on it, so it does have like, if you really like go up there and look at it, there is still like the tiniest a bit of sheen. So it's just a matter of how sensitive you are to it. I mean, like a Firehawk has a lot of sheen. To me, like there's no way I could use the screen. It's great for what it does, but like every time I get in a room, I'm like, oh my god. But there's other people like I have no idea what you're talking about, which is why like
Yeah.
when I go and calibrate or work on a system, if I'm seeing stuff that I think is like that I know is a product of the screen or the projector or whatever, I don't point it out because the thing is once you see something, it's hard to unsee it, and if you're not seeing it, like bless you, you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
you're so lucky. So
That's like
yeah,
that's like rainbow effect. People are
yep,
always like, usually if I'm doing that, if I mention rainbow effect, I'll say, if I can see it or if I can't. Then
right,
I'll say, listen, if you can't see it, I wouldn't go looking for it because you might
yeah,
not
and
be
if
able
you
to
can't.
unsee it.
And some people just can't see it. There are some people that don't. They're a little colorblind. There's just different. Everybody's different. There's sensitivities to stuff like that. I'm pretty sensitive to rainbows. So DLP, single chip DLP that has that is something that's bothersome, especially with again, like I like a dark movie environment, and I typically use my theater for watching movies, which I think brings it out a bit more. But if you're in like a lighter environment and everything else, and it might not be something that bothers you, but it's something that anybody that's making that choice should be aware of. So
Would you say that every ALR screen that I've gotten that was sent to me with like a UST screen, I've always noticed, just if I'm just sitting off to a wing seat, I always notice it's hot spotting.
yep,
It wouldn't matter whatever ALR screen I've had. I've always noticed it. Is
yep.
that is that depending on manufacturer, or is that just like with all
No,
ALR screens?
that's how they work. Again, they're rejecting light from a certain angle. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like LCD, where if you're looking at a panel, depending on the technology they're using and how they light it, an off-axis changes the way it looks and stuff like that. Well, in the case of an ALR screen, it's just again how the coating is designed to be used. There's white papers and stuff. I think Stewart has some like marketing publication. They'll kind of show you how that works. But yeah, you're just seeing the different gains and how it's rejecting the light. So the far you move off axis, the different it's going to look. The more, they've tried over the years. Like early generation ALR screens weren't nearly as good as the newer ones. But again, they are still going to look different than something like a normal gain or a zero gain screen. Now, I mean, even something like this, this is a Studio Tech 130, white screen or whatever. It has a certain amount because again, it is a gain coating. So now
Yeah.
we're into coatings now. This isn't really trying to reject light, but it
Yeah.
does to a certain extent because of the gain structure of it. So again, this coating isn't going to have probably as much of a like a the whatever you want to call it, sheen or whatever else, but it does reject a little bit. But it also, because if it's a gain, it's not going to have quite as much perfect uniformity and brightness from edge to edge as a 1.0 gain screen would have. So like this is a brighter screen because it's a 1.3 gain, so that means that it's 30% brighter than it would be if it was Lamberian. But it's funny is like I went from a Studio Tech 130 back in the day to a Studio Tech 100, and I didn't notice that much change in brightness. Now it measured a little different. Now granted it's only 30% and light is logarithmic, but it also was because the 100 had more uniformity, so the uniformity of brightness across the screen is a little more consistent, so maybe that lends to it. I don't know, but it's just something you always got to think about. So yeah.
Okay, so if you are in a dedicated theater room, don't get an ALR screen.
Well, you can. I mean, again, there's nothing saying you can't. And again, like even in a dark, dedicated room, depending on, because again, like there's people that say that they have a dark dedicated room, but they're just using flat paint, that's gray or black or a dark color, and they're like, oh, that does it. Well, that doesn't. It's better than white, but it's not as good as reflecting as, say, like a fabric, like a velvet or something like that. So you
Yeah.
still are getting light coming back. So yes, it would help with that. But the problem there is that whether or not the pros outweigh the cons. So are you going to start noticing hot spotting? Are you going to start noticing any kind of sheen on the on it and stuff like that? So I mean, you can use it. I mean, I've been in rooms that are really well light controlled and they have this is a black diamond. This is like one of the most extreme ALR screens and stuff like that. And I'm like, why is there a black diamond in this room? Because some of these, their gain coding doesn't work as well. You're giving up other things. So, again, everybody's sensitive to different things. It's not wrong to put an ALR screen into a dark room, but you have to realize, like, okay, what are the pros versus the cons for this tool in, for this toolbox? So.
Okay, so if you did have a perfectly blacked out room, say it's just really, it's dark enough. You got the black paint, or you got black fabric walls. It's a beautiful looking dedicated theater. It's not a living room, whatever. You wanted the most accurate. Would you pick just a regular plain old white screen, or would you go for the ALR?
If the room is pretty close to like as good as you can get for light control in the room, the most accurate screen would be a 1.0 Lamberian Surface. Yeah.
Okay.
Because again, it's not imparting anything. It's just light on, light off. That's it.
Yeah.
It's not doing anything to it. So yeah, like in my room, a 1.0 screen would be pretty good. Again, like I'm in that rare position where I've got to compare some stuff and everything. So I had a 1.0 in there. Now I have a 1.3 gain, but I have a newer generation of it. And like I looked at the pros and the cons of it, and the cons are extremely limited. So I was like, okay, but this also gives me, roughly a 30% boost in light for almost no drawback to it. There are drawbacks, but they're really small. So right. That's what I use. But if I didn't need to have the 30% increase in light, like if I just had light unlimited, then I'd have a 1.0 screen.
Whereas if you were in a living room setting, obviously you would go with the ALR screen,
yeah,
with like windows open and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, since we were talking about gain, explain what gain does. Some folks don't know what gain is. Like, what's 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3?
Exactly. It's another one again where it's like it's a gain. So if you have a 1.0 screen, Lamberian, it's mathematical, right? So whatever light hits it is the amount of light that gets off of it. So anything times 1 is that number. Now, obviously, you have light loss because of travel, propagation over a room. Light. It isn't going to stay constant the whole time. Just like sound, dies off as you get away from a speaker. But the screen is not doing anything to raise or lower the amount of light that's hitting it. So as you go up, like 1.1, 1.3, okay, well, that's 1.3 times that. So 30% increase, 1.5, 50% increase. So that's where you get into other factors where like in this case, like a Studio Tech 130, a very popular screen, 1.3 gain. Again, like if the numbers were perfectly mathematical, and again, like because this has a gain coding, it's going to be a little different at different parts of it or whatever. But theoretically, it's a 30% increase in the light that's hitting it versus what's coming off of it. So it's a way to increase the brightness that you have, right? If we got into something like this is a Seymour Enlightener Neo. Pretty popular acoustically transparent screen, a weave, right? This has a gain. I think they advertise like 0.8 or 0.9. It's probably closer to like a 0.7, 0.6. So when I say that, that means that it's only reflecting 60% of the light that hits it. And why is that? Well, it's because it's acoustically transparent, right? So it has to have a certain amount of pass through for the sound to get through it. It's not a solid surface. So you're losing light that's going through it because there's a certain amount that's reflected on it, and then there's a certain amount that just passes right through it. So when people talk to me about like, hey, I'm going to do an acoustically transparent screen, which is pretty popular. I want to have my speakers behind my screen. The two main, ones that are out there are a weave-based screen. This is a weave. This is a weave. I've got a couple weaves here. This is a weave and stuff like that. Or like this is a weave. I've got a bunch of weaves here. I have so many screen samples, you wouldn't believe it. Or you could use a perforated screen. And where did I set it? Oh yeah, right here. The Studio Tech 130 I have. You probably can't see it. I guess you can right there. So this is the perforated version, so you can see the little perfs. This
Yep.
is a micro. Oh no, this is the new one, the Ultra Perf. So they have the Ultra Perf, which you can see the perforations are really small and there's a pretty good gap between them. And then
Yep.
there's the old micro perf one. I don't have a sample of that right here, where the perfs are a little bit bigger and a little bit closer together. So there, those two different ones. So, the marketing, and stuff like that will basically tell you like, oh, you really want to weave because it's more acoustically transparent than a microperf is, right? Or whatever, right? So then we get back to that subjectivity, right? So like, I guess you'd have to look at like a graph that would show you like the graph of this says that, it's only attenuating the sound, this much at these frequencies, right? Because, at certain frequencies, this doesn't exist. And then as you go up and up and up in frequencies, as the wavelength becomes smaller, it's going to bounce off the material or whatever. So you're attenuating it to a certain amount. Just like if I put my hand here in front of my mouth, I'm attenuating that noise a little bit, right? So this has a different attenuation factor than that. So a lot of the thing is like, oh, a weave is better than a microperf. Well, I mean, I guess again we can get into subjectivity because most of the frequencies that are being rolled off by the material are really high in the spectrum, like in the teens, and most of that is in an area that our ears don't really work, especially
Would
you
that
and I.
would that even matter with EQ, the room correction?
Well,
Could you
that's what
just
I was going to get into. So
yeah.
one, our hearing, like, as adults and stuff like that starts to roll off as you get older, right? So like we're probably really only good to about like mid-teens, 14K or something like that. So if the area that's being attenuated is, pretty much past your perception of hearing frequencies anyway, that doesn't matter. And then again, it is an attenuation. So yeah, and if you have a calibration being done or whatever, you should technically be able to, bring back that noise depending on how much it's being attenuated. But also like, if you look at like most, target curves for a room, they're at they're on a downslope anyway. So
Yeah.
again, there's all kinds of things that can go into this and stuff. And I'm not saying that there aren't advantages to this versus, this as a material, but the question then becomes, if I have this and I have this and there's differences in sound, how much of that sound difference can be accommodated for with calibration? For, adjusting the gain or whatever, or how much of it is even noticeable because of the hearing that we have, right?
Yep.
But if I have this and I have this, we're talking about roughly a 50% difference in how much brightness is coming off your screen. You can't compensate for that.
Yeah.
So if you have a projector, like I buy an NZ900, that NZ900 has, let's just use a round number, 1,000 lumens, right? And I have a target white that I'm trying to achieve, for a minimum brightness in my room. This immediately you are throwing away roughly 30 to 40% of the light that projector has. So you might as well have just bought a 700 lumen projector. This is going to give you roughly a 20% increase in light. So your 1000 lumen projector just became a 1200 lumen projector. So are you going to notice the 50% of light that you threw away more? Or are you going to notice, the sound that you did? Now, again, it would depend on how much headroom you have in the light engine and how big the screen is and how much light you really need. But in most cases, we're running out of light way before we're running out of anything else. So, it's one of the more important things that you're spending money on.
Can they add gain to an acoustically, well, like a weave screen? Can you add gain to that, or is it? Would it
There
have
are
a
some that have a gain coding. This one right here is a Seymour XD. I think they advertise this at around a 1.0 gain because it does have a sheen. It does have a coating on it. So it's a little more rigid. It's almost like a plastic kind of thing compared to, this where it's just like almost cotton. And yes, you can do that. And obviously that would help. It would give you a bit more gain. Like anything else. And this is something to also consider with a microperf or whatever. Because this has a gain on it and because it's also textured because of the weave,
Yeah.
there is the chance that if you're sitting too close to the screen, like, depending on your seating distance and the size of the screen, you might start to notice the texture of this or even see the weave. So XD screens, I generally would tell somebody you want to be like 12 plus feet away, especially if you're sensitive. I would tell anybody, if you're thinking about any kind of screen, that you ask for a sample of it so that at least you can tell. There's other things with testing samples that you got to be careful of, because somebody would be like, if they have like two samples next to each other, like, well, that one looks bluish and that one looks greenish, or whatever. That's just because of the gain coding. Like, all of that would not be a factor if it's calibrated. They would all be able to look the same. You just have to compensate for the screen. But if you're talking about like, hey, am I going to notice this texture? Am I going to notice the perforations of this because I'm sitting so close? So like I said, this is the ultra perf, and they used to have the micro perf. Well, the micro perf, you had to be like 12, 13 feet away before, for a lot of people, again, it depends on your visual acuity, where you might see the perforations themselves. But with the ultra perf, you might be able to sit like 10 feet, maybe even 9 feet. And again, it visual acuity. But it's just like at a movie theater, like all the screens that are in front of you at a movie theater have some kind of perforation, most likely. It's rare that you get a weave in a commercial cinema, but if you're sitting far enough back, you don't notice it. And then there's also like, a weave or a perf is going to have a resolution hit compared to a solid surface screen, because again, the pixels, like are interacting with those and stuff. And there's even a chance to get like a moire effect or things like that. So again, these are all things that have to be considered. But again, it's, I need to put the speakers behind the screen. So therefore I need to make a decision on what I want to do. And there are trade-offs, each way. So you have to find out which trade-off is going to have the most subjective, effect on what you're trying to do that may bother you or take you out of the experience, because you're like, damn, I keep noticing that, or I keep noticing that. So
Yeah. Okay, let's be real. With some of these weave screen, is it just spandex or what?
No, like this one, like you can see, it's just a fabric, and
Yeah.
I don't know where they sourced this from. I had the chance a few years ago, like right before COVID started, where I went to Stewart, and they were, at that time, experimenting. I think this is the Stewart Harmony screen, if I remember right. And
Yeah, I
you can
used to have
see
one
it's
of
a
those.
fabric as well.
Yeah.
They were experimenting with a bunch of, like, they had, I swear they had like 10 or 15 different fabrics there. So they're looking at like the uniformity of them, that, like the weave of them, like how tight it is, things like that. So, where other ones that are, like a bunch of different materials are different. This is the XD, but then like this one's the SoundMax 4K, which I think is an XY screen. I don't remember. There's so many brands, but
Yeah.
this one's very similar to the XY. I mean, to the XD. There might
Yeah.
be a slight difference in gain and stuff like that, but none of these are spandex. When you get to like solid surface screens, they might have a backing that's like kind of stretchy. Like Stewart screens are definitely like
Yeah.
that, but they're
They're
not
black.
spandex. So like, if you ever have the opportunity, I highly, 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 highly recommend doing a tour at Stewart in California. They will take you, because they, outside of the Neve, the Cineneve screens, everything is made in house. So they have these just absolutely enormous rooms that you go in, and it's got like a mesh, and they have they create a chemical, and they have these sprayers that spray this chemical onto the mesh, and it dries into the screen. And then they have
Gotcha.
these things that just peel the screen off the mesh, and then they cut out the size of the screen, and it has a certain amount of elasticity, and then the chemical that's used has a certain amount of gain. So depending on the size of the screen, it's a different chemical. So like, depending, because you might need a more rigid amount of flexibility for something that's 200 inches versus like a 110-inch screen. So there's different, they'll call it like a Studio Tech 130 versus a Snowmat versus a Studio Tech 100 versus, or whatever. So that a lot of has to do with the rigidity of it, because again, different size screens, you want it needs different properties and stuff like that to hold its rigidity. But they literally just spray it and then cut it and then put it's if you're even into this stuff at all and you have the opportunity to do it, trust me, it's a really cool experience.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I'll get, I've had a few like just fabric screens, like the first one you held up there.
Yep.
Sometimes I'll take it out of the box. I'm like, dude, this looks like my t-shirt. I was like, I
Yeah.
don't know. Is this
Well, I
worth
mean, it's a fabric.
$4,000?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fabric, and stuff, and stuff, and it has to be that way to do certain things. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just it is what it is.
Yeah.
There are differences between like this is one from I think this is dang it, this is the Model 7, but I can't Dream Screen. So this is the Dream Screen, right? So this one's interesting because it is a weave, and you can see it's white. It's a little thicker because it has the black backing actually
Yeah.
built into the material. So like if you look at it from the side, it's a multi-layer. So this has the scrim built into it. So a scrim is nice because obviously, as we said, you're going to get light that passes through this, that
Yeah.
hits, whatever's behind it, and then will reflect, right? So if you have your speakers behind the screen, or like, like a metal frame or whatever, that light might pass through the screen and then reflect off that, so you're seeing like shimmers of stuff that's behind the screen, or like you could just make out like your tweeter has got like a little sparkle
Yeah.
on it or something. Well, having a scrim like this makes it where the likelihood of that is not going to happen, because the light passing through it or coming back at it is absorbed by the scrim that's in it. So this is a pretty nice material as well, where it has it back, built into it. And almost all these companies have the option of a scrim, like, Seymour Screen Excellence is really popular for weave screens. They make some great screens. I think all the Stewart ones include a scrim, by design. You have to tell them you
Yeah.
don't want it and stuff like that. But this one
Yeah,
is actually built into it.
my SI one came with one, but I didn't put it on it because I figured it would maybe add some more attenuation to my speakers, so I left it
It
off.
shouldn't. It should still
No?
just be the same acoustically transparent material. It doesn't matter what color it is.
Okay. So well, I left it off because I didn't notice my speakers or anything behind it until I got the Epson. I was like, is that my speaker behind the screen? I was
Yeah,
like, oh
because
my
you have
God.
way more light passing through it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So if
crazy.
you have 10,000 lumens and screen is, let's say a zero point 0.7 gain, right? That means 30% of the light is passing through it. So now if you have 10,000 lumens, that means that 3,000 lumens got through it and is now reflecting on whatever's behind it. So you see how the ratio of numbers starts to work, where if you have a projector that's only putting out 2,000 lumens and you're losing 30%, you're talking about 300 lumens reflecting off of whatever's behind it. So the likelihood of you seeing it is obviously a lot lower. In this case, 10 times lower, right? 300 to
Yeah.
3,000.
So if you're going to get a screen with a gain on it, is there a specific feet distance requirement for that specific gain where you're not going to hotspot?
There might be. Again, I'd have you always refer back that usually if you go to any manufacturer and you're looking at a screen, they'll tell you all of these things. They'll usually show you like what they recommend, the screen sizes, screen distance, and things like that. The higher you go in gain, the more likely that you're going to have some kind of sheen on it. So like a Studio Tech 130, again, very popular screen in home theater. If you go to a Studio Tech 150, which is a 1.5, so a 50% gain, I notice a lot of sheen on that. But again, if you're in a room where you have a really big screen and you can't afford a projector that puts out 10,000 lumens or anything like that, this is a way that you can gain, light. Kind of another example of this, again, like people sometimes don't think about like this kind of stuff that much. So in projection, really popular thing is anamorphic lenses, Panamorph, DCR lenses and things like that. So a Panamorph DCR lens retails for $9,000 for the DCR, right? So a DCR lens will generally give you maybe 25 to a 30% increase in light between the factor of the projector at a different zoom and then the compression of the image of the screen. So $9,000, and I just bought myself 25 to 30% increase in light, right? That's generally, like, I am a Panamorph dealer, right? So when people ask me why would I buy a Panamorph lens, it would be like, well, you need the light, it's a light increase. But let's say that they call me and they tell me that, like, hey, I'm thinking about, a lens, it's a lot of money. I don't know if I have the money for that or whatever. And we'll ask them, well, what's the screen that you're using? And they're like, well, I have an Enlightener Neo, and it's 0.7, 0.6 gain, more realistically. And, I'm like, okay, well, how far away are you sitting from it? And they're sitting, 14 feet back from the screen. And they're like, okay, well, where are the speakers and stuff like that? Well, I'm like, well, for half the price of the lens, you could just put a micro or an ultra perf screen in that's like a Studio Tech 130 and get 50% of an increase in light. So I just gave you 20% more than the lens will give you for half the price. So these are all things that, again, like who you're working on or who you're talking to and stuff like that. They should be able to tell you that, but they don't always tell you that kind of stuff because you're probably going to make more money off the lens than you are off the screen.
What about negative gain screens? What's the use case for a negative gain screen?
Negative gain screen is if the opposite. Like, let's say you have a projector that just throws out a ton of light and you don't want much light. You could technically go to a negative gain screen. A lot of times it has more to do with the material it is, but it's very rare that I'm ever in a situation that would need a negative gain screen. Like an example, let's say for some reason you put in the QB7000, right? Is the 10,000 lumen one?
Yeah,
The Epson.
QL.
Yeah. So let's say I put that in. A lot of times they have like a slider for how much light output they have. So, it's like their laser light output slider. It might go from 0 to, 100. Well,
Yeah.
in most cases, when that happens, 0, it doesn't mean 0. Like if you
Yeah.
go to 0, it's not off, right? So I have seen laser projectors from other manufacturers where like the difference between 100 to 0 is only like 30% decrease or 40% decrease in light. So if you have a really high output projector, but you happen to have a smaller screen and for some reason you bought the bright version of it, you might not be able to go low enough in your laser output for comfortable viewing, depending on, again, the viewing condition, the size of the screen and stuff like that. So you might be like, oh my God, I can't watch this. It's just always bright, 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 bright. And again, this comes back to like whoever spec'd this stuff should have known better, but it happens. So a negative gain screen could technically help you combat that a little bit by taking a ways off. But again, like this is something that should have just been thought about when they spec'd, the room and things like that. Like, anybody that's specking a projection system should have a good idea of like how much light are you really going to have off the screen coming back to you, and is it too much or is it too little? I find more often than not it's too little. Like people just love big screens, and then they put projectors in there that don't really have any business lighting up that screen because they want the best projector, but the best projector isn't the best projector for every situation. You have to think about how much light it puts out and then how big an area it has to light up, and then what the gain of that screen is and things like that. So it's like saying a Ferrari is the best car, but if I work at a dirt track, it's not really a good car for that.
So would you get a negative gain screen if you had an Epson and you wanted to get better black levels? Would you go negative gain with that?
Yeah, so that's another one that's an interesting one. So people would say like, and I've heard that like they say that like, oh well, like this is a 0.7 screen. Our blacks are better. Your blacks aren't any better because the black is only a function of the contrast of the projector. So like, again, if I have, my black floor is X and my white is this, you're just taking, here's my contrast range, right? Here's my white point, here's my black point, and that's a fixed number based on the display. So like, let's say, again, using easy numbers, that it's 1,000 to 1, and I use a negative gain screen, all that I'm doing is I'm just taking everything down compared to like a 1.0 screen. So, yeah, it would make your black floor better, but at the expense of your white coming down as well, because again, the range is just moving. So it's not doing this, which would increase your contrast, right? Where like we've made your blacks lower, but your white stayed the same. So it's a misnomer that it's like, yeah, your black's getting better, but it's just, I mean, I could have put an ND filter on the front of the lens and done the same thing or something along those lines. So again, like you just spec a projector that's probably too bright for the room. So, Epson makes other ones, in this case, we're talking about Epson, but it's the same with any kind of manufacturer. Like if you don't need a 10,000 lumen projector to achieve the white point that you want, the brightness that you want, maybe get the one that's 6,000 lumens or 4,000 lumens or whatever. So, The only conditions I can think of that kind of mitigate that a little bit are projectors that allow you to use light headroom. So the Epson is not one of these. JVC does. JVC lets you use it in two different ways. It has a removable color filter on the upper models. So if you have headroom in the light engine where you have more light than you technically need to achieve the white point that you want, you could put the color filter in place and get more color gamut coverage at the expense of so much light. But if you have light to give, now you can use it that. They also have apertures in their lens that you can close down to increase the native contrast ratio because they're blocking so much stray light. So with extra headroom in the light engine, you can increase the dynamic range of the projector by cutting down on stray light, because what happens in those is it does cut a little bit of your white, but it also cuts more of your black at the same time because of how it's dealing with scatter in the lens itself. So you're increasing dynamic range. You're not just moving it like you would if you had like an ND filter or something like that. But there's very few projectors out there that allow you to use that headroom in that way. So sometimes you just have extra light that you don't need. And in that case, then you probably would have saved money by just buying the model right below it. Because like in the Epson's case, I imagine, there's the 7000 and the one right below it is probably exactly the same projector, just with a different light engine, so that you don't need 10,000 lumens. You now have 6,000 or 7,000 lumens.
Right. All right. Speaking of the Epson QL7000, you got a chance to see this at a shootout recently.
It wasn't in the shootout itself. No. So it was there.
Comparison. Okay.
It wasn't. No. What I mean is that it wasn't part of the comparison. So Epson was at the event, and they brought the entire lineup, I believe. And the place that we were at was like a hotel that had like conference rooms, like you see at like trade shows. So we had one room that the comparison was being done, and in that we used the QB1000. And then in the next room over, Epson had their own static room where they had the 7000 in its own room on a really large screen with lights on and stuff, showing that like, hey, if you have all this light, you can do a really big screen and also have a lot of ambient light, because again, you have so much light to overcome the light in the room. And then they had like the other ones on like a static display off to the side where you could see them and see that the lenses are interchangeable and things like that. So the 7000 wasn't used in the comparison at all. It's more of an application-based projector, because 10,000 lumens is great, but like for what we were comparing on, it didn't really make any sense, because the QB1000 is nearly the exact same projector. It's just not as bright, right? You're just changing brightness levels.
Oh, but come on, man! When I had it, it was pretty impressive.
Yeah, for sure. And again, like it's only a factor. The beautiful thing about the 7000 is it's 10,000 lumens for like what, 30 grand. So that's really hard to find. It's hard to find something that has that much light output for that thing. So it makes it where if you want to have a big screen, 170, 200 inch screen, you can light that screen up and not have to pay for like a projector that would normally cost maybe $75,000 or more for 10,000 lumens and stuff like that. But
Sony.
You also have to think about it in the respect of like, when you're buying a projector with 10,000 lumens because you have a screen that's 170, 200 inches, 250 inches or whatever, you're buying that because that allows you to achieve light levels that I'm achieving with a lower lumen projector on a screen that's more, more appropriate for the space that I'm in. So now, obviously, if I put that projector on my screen, it's going to be really bright. And some people just like really, really bright, obviously. But the problem also with that is that it has a finite amount of contrast. So let's say, it's an Epson, so it's probably like 4,000 to 1 contrast. Well, that means that my black floor is, really, really high. So let's say now I'm getting, 300, 400, 500 nits on screen. Well, that sounds great. But now my black floor is, basically where the mid grays are on the projector I use in my room. So you're just trading off a lot of brightness for really poor black performance and stuff like that. But again, like I get it. Some people really want to have brightness. I would rather have both, but there's a trade-off for that too. So
when I had it, I was like, oh man, do I really like the 900s blacks, or do I just want to be blown out?
Right.
I'll be honest with you, I could go either way. I was
Yeah.
definitely more wowed with the 7000 when I had
And
it.
it would
It's,
also
it's
depend
nice.
again on the room. Like my room's a really dark room, really light controlled, so that much brightness over time would probably be pretty fatiguing and stuff like that. It would be super cool, and it's like anything else. Like there's pros and cons to everything. It would just be a matter of do the pros outweigh the cons for me compared to, the kind of viewing that I do in the room that I have compared to something where I'm already getting what I feel is like a nice bright punchy picture. I mean, my wife still complains going like in transitions and stuff like that. I can only imagine what it would be if I did something like that. But again, like that has so much light and I can't use any of it for anything else. So like even if I only need half the amount of light, I can't do anything with the extra light that it has. I would love it if I could, like, oh, okay, you've got 10,000 lumens, but you also have the ability to stop down an iris so I can at least get my blacks a little bit better and stuff. But for something like that, you would need like a GTZ 380, and even that doesn't have a stop down aperture, but it has at least more native contrast. You're starting to see people modify like Barcos and Christie's where they put a fixed aperture in the lens to try to get the contrast up at the expense of some of the light, but they have so much light to start with that it works out pretty good. So
Yeah.
yep, again it's all just trade offs. What do you want, and what are you trying to achieve?
Is there a future where JVC does 10,000 lumens, you think?
I have no idea. I've bugged them for years saying that like I would love to see like maybe something closer to like 5,000 lumens. I think once you hit a certain point, like the problem is your market is shrinking so much. How many people need a home theater projector that even puts out more than 5,000 lumens? Again, a lot of the argument that you do, I think that really the only one is like, again, really, really, really big screens, which, I mean, they're out there, but they're rare. So that market is small. So you're spending a bunch of R&D and everything else to the projector that has a finite, amount of clients that are even, doing that. 3D would have been probably a good application for that because you're losing so
Yeah.
much light through the glasses.
Glasses. Yeah.
A lot of people would say like, oh, well, we have HDR though, right? You want it to be as bright as possible, but it's, again, almost another whole episode of just like, well, HDR is about high dynamic range. So if you have something that's really bright like that, like, yeah, you're giving a little more resolvability to the brighter portion of the image, but you're doing it at the expense of the low end of it. So, an Epson at 10,000 lumens has a contrast ratio of 4,000 to 1. No matter what you do, that's always going to be the case. So your brights are going to look really bright, but your bottom end is only a difference of 4,000, right? Where in my room upstairs, I'm at like my contrast ratio right now, static alone is 40,000 to 1. So which one has more high dynamic range? Well, the difference between the bright and the dark on mine is 10 times what yours is. So who's more HDR? So again, as long as you have enough peak white, where, you're still getting a nice bright punchy image. But nobody walks into my room and watches something and says like, oh, it was good, but it was kind of dull. It's like, no, it looks great.
And until
Because
you
again,
put
it's a
it,
viewing environment and things like that, field of
until
view
you
and all that.
until you put it next to a 7,000, they'll be like, oh, okay, it's dull.
Yeah, but that's because that's a misnomer as well. I've seen that where it's like, okay, so if you're testing it for the vacuum of the room, that works. So like let's say that you and I were, like, hey, I have $30,000 to spend. Should I buy an Epson with 10,000 lumens or should I buy a JVC NZ900 with 3,000 lumens, right? So if we put it into my room, depending on my screen size, and what that screen gain is, obviously the Epson might be the better projector just because it can actually light it to a level that like makes for nice viewing. Where if the screen is too big and acoustically transparent, the JVC might not have any business at all even being considered because it's not giving you enough light to begin with, right? But the analogy of just like, well, let's just run them full out, and let's say on my screen where either of them can give me enough light, the Epson's going to give me way more light than I need. The JVC will give me more than enough where it's still like insanely bright. My screen's 140 inch diagonal, right? Because of the size of my room and stuff like that. But that's like the analogy of like, well, let's compare two speakers, but let's run one speaker at half the output of the other. well, obviously this speaker's better because it's louder, but it's not as good in all the other ways. You're just overpowering the other one, right? So if you that's why I always say if you're going to compare projectors for picture quality, you compare them light matched so that you're seeing their, like how they compare in all the things that they do compared to each other equally. And then in terms of how bright they go is what you should be using to determine whether or not they'll light up a certain size screen. So it's only one factor, but it's a factor that could dominate everything else because again, it's like if you took a PA speaker and like a high-end Wilson speaker and you measured them in every quantifiable way, the Wilson would probably be a better speaker or whatever, like, less distortion, all those things like that. But because the other one can play really, really loud, now it's the better speaker. Like that doesn't make sense. So again, like the application versus like what you're trying to achieve. So because you could flip it the other way, right? If I have an Epson and I have a JVC and you're like, no, I just love how bright this image is. Like the Epson is the one, right? Well, that means that you like the brightness of that image. So I can measure the brightness of that image. And let's say you're like, it looks amazing. That's what I want. And I measure it off the screen and it's 200 nits, right? Well, if we were in another room that has a screen that the JVC could be 200 nits and the Epson could both be 200 nits, now which one would you prefer? Because I guarantee you it wouldn't be the Epson, because as soon as I started showing you dark material and things like that, you'd be like, oh man, like, yeah, like this no contest. But you were so enamored with that. It's like, yeah, you just need to make sure that you have a projector and a screen that can give you X brightness is what you're looking for. But obviously what you really want is something that does all of it, right?
So how did the 1000 stack up to the other projectors that you saw? Which
all of
models
the,
did you compare to?
we did two comparisons. The first comparison was the QB 1000 against the JVC NZ, excuse me, the NZ 500 and the Valerian Pro 2. And we did that based on kind of the price points. I think the Valerian's like 3,000 something dollars if you buy it now, not when it was in the Kickstarter. The JVC is like $5,000 or $6,000, and then I don't remember, the Epson's like somewhere right around the JVC. Although there was a price increase, but then it went away because of the tariffs. So I don't know where the price point is of that, but we did that. The last shootout we used the LS 12,000, so we didn't want to bring that one back in. So we used the newer JVC entry model, the Valerian, and the Epson. So those three were competed against each other. The Epson was the brightest of the bunch. The JVC was the most contrast range of the bunch, and the Valerian was the only one that could do full 2020 color. It's also a portable projector, so it has other things that the other ones don't have versus the long throw projectors and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I thought every projector at the comparison, looked really good. I always talk about like we're in that golden age where honestly, like most projectors on their own look fantastic. Like it's harder to find a bad one than it is to find a good one. But they're different, they all do different things. So it's a matter of, like, well, does this light up the screen that you want? Does this have that, whatever? When we showed a lot of the bright content, I felt, at least from the feedback that I saw, most people thought they looked more similar than dissimilar. There were times that the brightness of one or the compression of their HDR looked a little different with some clips. That really showed more in some of the material that we use that looks a lot like what you see in like when you go to like Best Buy. They always show like these demo reels that really they're only comparable to themselves. They're like stuff like sells TVs, but like nothing you watch on TV looks like that.
Yeah.
They always do these like like whatever, like we had one where it was a Sony clip that was a parade in Rio and stuff, and it looks cool, it's all shot, but like again, like nothing that I've watched in the last like 5 years looks like that other than that clip.
Yeah.
And stuff. So those, really showcase the brightness, like they really kind of, emphasize the things that the manufacturer wants to emphasize when they're showing displays. And obviously that was created for like a flat panel or something like that. So like the brightness of like the Valerian and the Epson, really like, oh wow, look at how punchy that is. And then their tone mapping's a lot more compressed, so everything is bright. So it's like and stuff in front of you. But as soon as we started watching anything with movies and stuff, they either generally looked pretty much identical, or the JVC would pull way ahead because of the like how it handled the darker content that we showed. We used examples from like Blade Runner and Zero Dark 30 for that, and usually what I do is I show one, show the other, and show the next. I never show them side by side in the actual comparison, because in real life you're never watching a display side by side. And the other thing is when you have two displays side by side, it skews your perception of the other one. So I've seen people that are like, "Hey, I have this projector. I think it looks fantastic," and I'll have them bring it over here, and we'll look at it, and they'll be like, "Yeah, look at it. It looks fantastic." And then I'll show them against my projector, even with it light matched. And they're like, "Oh, something," and then we'll go back to their projector, and they're like, no, something's wrong. You changed something. Well, I changed your perception of the projector because now you've seen the other one. So when you see something in on its own, it will look different than if you're comparing it directly to something else. So I like just showing the projectors one at a time. And then at the end of it, we always take comments from the people that are there saying like, "Hey, we have a few minutes. I can do a side by side now if you want to see, a more extreme example of it." Because I always tell people, like, if I show you a clip and then show you the same clip and then show you the same clip on three different projectors that are matched, or whatever. In this case, we matched them for SDR, and then we let them be their brightest, that they can be for HDR. And I show you the clip and you're like, "I didn't really see a difference." That probably means that there's not enough difference that it matters. But if I show you a clip, the next clip, and there's like obvious differences, then there's obviously enough difference in the performance that it matters, that you're seeing that difference. Because there's always little bits of difference, right? And so at the end, I always say, "Okay, I'll open it up if you guys want to do any side-by-side ones." And every single time they wanted to see the dark stuff, like Zero Dark 30. Let's see those two side by side. Nobody ever picked. I think one time somebody picked a bright clip on there, and then they were talking more about the compression of it and stuff like that. I ended up picking out one that was more like of a mid-range tone one. It was an animated piece that I wanted to show a side by side with, just to kind of show something that was different than just always going to, "Oh, let's see these two with Zero Dark 30. Oh my God, look at how much different they look," and stuff like that. But that's how it always works. Like the brighter parts usually just always look the same. So,
do you notice the pixel structure, or I guess people call it the screen door effect, on Epson or the Valerian?
I did not on either of them. Both of them use a 4x pixel shift, so they're not like the old 2x shift projectors. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, if you're sitting closer, the Epson does, their pixel fill is only so much because it's LCD. The wires are running between them. And then, with DLP, depending on the pixel, like the size of the chip itself, and again, like some people like that their fill is not quite as high because it gives it more of that digital look, where some people associate that with looking sharper because you can make out the pixel more. But if you thought about it, like the more pixel fill you have, the less of a pixelated look it has, the more smooth it looks. Just like, going from 2K to 4K, 4K to 8K. At some point, it doesn't matter. All you're doing is smoothing it. It's not going to be sharper because at some point you're past the perception of anything other than the smoothness of the image. So 8K isn't sharper than 4K. It's just more pixel density. So therefore, it's most likely smoother than 4K or whatever. I did notice it more with the LS12000 when we did that comparison. But I was a little closer up to the screen at that point. But nobody noticed anything nobody once mentioned anything about screen door effect. Honestly, from like almost all distances that we had chairs at and stuff, you couldn't tell the difference between the 1080p shifting and the 4K, the native 4K ones at that point. I imagine if we did like test patterns and stuff, there might be some differences between them, but like with moving motion content and stuff like that, it's just it wasn't a factor with the 4K shifting. 4K shifts work really, really well.
Because I feel when I had the 1000 and the 7000, I would notice it on really bright white.
Yeah, but if you were running it really, really bright, then it's, like you have more light going in there and stuff like that. So we just didn't notice it then. And it also could be, again, like how close are you sitting, things like that. So how big is the screen you're using?
I got a 150. My first row is at like 10 feet. This size is like 16.
Yeah. 10 feet's pretty close to a 150.
I don't like it. It gives me that IMAX
Oh no, oh I get it.
feel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But if you had like the 7,000 and that thing's like cranked way up, that's a lot of light. Yeah. So again, like that's what I mean is like
Yeah.
the more resolution you have as you go bigger and bigger and brighter, the better it would be, obviously, because that becomes a non-factor. But that's just not an option. You can't find a native 4K projector that does 10,000 lumens for less than like what, $90,000. The GTZ 380 is the first one I can think of,
Yeah.
because all the DLPs are shifters until they're like a hundred grand or more.
Yeah. I don't know, man. Just every time, even with the DLPs, just the regular DLPs, I feel like I can just see it. I can see it from 10 or 15 feet away. Something about it. I mean, it's sharp. It's super sharp. Don't get me wrong. It is super sharp, but it doesn't, like when you go to movies, it doesn't look smooth. I guess it's smooth. I think it's sharper. I think JVC and Sony's are sharper. I just think the DLPs and the Epsons
It's a
have
different,
that.
but again, it is a different pixel fill.
Yeah.
So, it might not be a sharpness versus you're just seeing the pixel structure because of the fill. Like LCOS has a really, really high pixel fill. So does SSRD, DLP. Obviously, when you go into a cinema, depending on where you're sitting, like again, now that it's the same resolution, right? Like in most
Yeah.
cases, it's 2K. Like most cinemas aren't even 4K. There are 4K projectors out there, but a lot of them are still 2K. So now you're talking about a lower pixel fill and less resolutions. But even if you had 4K, there's a chance that you could see the pixel, and stuff like that. I definitely notice it. Like there's a IMAX theater that's not that far from me. I don't go there very often, but huge screen, and they're
Yeah.
using the 2K IMAX projectors, and I
Yeah.
notice pixel structure pretty easily on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. We got one of those around here too. I can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only thing about the Epson. Well, man, I can see it. I mean, the last two models I thought were okay. And my second row, I was like, oh, I could probably live with this.
Yep.
But then if I was in the front row, I'd be like, oh no, I could see what it's doing. I don't like it. Or
And
is that
that's
just,
always something
obviously,
again to consider. Big screens, and stuff like
yeah,
that. Like, is that going to be a factor? Is the material you're going to use for that screen a factor because it's a big screen? And
yeah,
what kind of gain do you have? How much light output do you have? So again, like it's the synergy of the system and the things that you have to take into account for it. So the bigger the screen, the more light you're probably going to need to achieve a light level that you want. So if you know what kind of light level you want, you can compute that ahead of time. Some people like 100 nits. Some people still like 50 nits. Some people like 200, 300 nits. There's nothing wrong with like the preference of liking one thing or another. But, okay, so let's say you like 200, 300 nits, but you also like really dark blacks. So that would narrow down, like, okay, well, if I want to achieve that, do I like the blacks of the Epson? Do I like the blacks of the DLP? The Epsons are going to be a little bit more better than the DLP. The Sony is going to be a little bit better than the Epson. The JVC is going to be a little bit better than the Sony, stuff. But do they light up enough, or do I need to move up to the next model to get that, or whatever? Or is this screen going to be a factor because I decided to get this screen, and I'm losing some of that light, But if I get this other screen, I might start noticing the perforations on it because I'm sitting 10 feet away from it. Like on 10 feet from a 150-inch screen, if you had a micro perf screen, that would be something I'd be like, hey, you really want to make sure you get a sample of this. Use some painter's tape, put it up on the screen, and then look at some stuff that's bright and look to see if you would notice that text, the holes and stuff like that. Or if you're using a material that's a weave screen that has a gain structure, because like this fabric, it can make it actually look like it's dirty, like there's something on the screen and stuff like that. So you want to make sure that you're sensitive, that those things are addressed for you, because again, it's all used in a vacuum, and everybody's a little different on what they like and what they don't like and stuff like that. So you have to find out what those things are and then try to put together a synergistic, system that addresses those things. You're going to have a compromise, most likely, but you're trying to find the compromises that bother you the least. So
How did you feel about the blacks on the Valerian?
they were what I expected. It was a low contrast DLP. Now they have their laser dimming. I don't really feel comfortable really talking about my opinions on the Valerian. I thought it's a cool technology. I love what they're trying to achieve with it and everything. The problem is the unit that we had was the review unit that Sammy Prescott from Projector Central had reviewed, and he had
Yeah.
a lot of praise for the projector. I was excited to see it. He was talking about, like, he did the review, so you could read that. And he was pretty excited about a lot of things of it, because there's a lot of things I really like about DLP. There's things I don't like, and there's things that I like. So I was excited to see. It's obviously getting a lot of buzz, which is always great. But the problem is that Valerian sent us some firmware that they wanted us to load for the event that I guess addressed some things that people in the beta group or whatever had been complaining about. So by the time I got there, Sammy had already loaded it, and he had already actually calibrated the projector before I got there for the event, because he had helped me with that. He did a fantastic job, but we had to kind of tweak all the calibration when we moved it to the room we were going to do the actual comparison in. It wasn't the same. It was the same screen and everything, but there's slight differences in throw. So we just wanted to make sure everything was exactly what it should be. So we kind of spent the day right before the event, like, tweaking everything. So I started looking at it and looking at some of the content, and he said that the new firmware, it wasn't really performing as well as it did before. But again, we loaded it because they told us they wanted it loaded. So he said the contrast, their dimming stuff wasn't really working as well. The image, it didn't look bad, but it wasn't what I was expecting based on the feedback I had gotten on it. So the first day when we did it looked fine. It excelled in some areas and it wasn't that good in other areas. And then before the next day, they did a full factory reset on the projector, and then it performed a lot different than it did the first day. And it was better in some regards, but worse in others. It was better in brighter scenes, but worse in dark scenes. Like it almost was like their dimming wasn't even doing anything. Plus the rainbow effect was really bad the second day. So now if somebody asked me, like, well, what'd you think of the Valerian? I'm like, well, I mean, I felt different about it day one than I did day two, but I have no idea if this is just like a beta build firmware. Now they're completely different than they were when I saw it. So I don't feel like it's, fair for me to really say anything about the projector, because I don't know if what I saw is even representative of what it would be if you bought one right now. I think it's a really cool idea. Like, what they're trying to achieve is fantastic. A 3000 lumen, 4K projector with true 2020 color and stuff like that. I mean, who wouldn't be excited about that? And I've always loved seeing new projectors being added to the market as opposed to being taken away. I would really like to reserve judgment on it until I see one that's like, yes, this is our final firmware, and this is what we want it to be and stuff like that. But, I applaud them for trying to push the boundaries of, what can be achieved, especially at that price point, and some of the exciting technologies that they're adding into it.
Yeah. What about their choice? I think what are they using, the 0.47 DMD as opposed to the 0.65?
Yeah, they're doing a 4-way shift on it, and I think that requires that you do that. But, without comparing the two side by side with like the exact same projector, you would have to have something where it's like, here's the projector with a 0.67, here's one with a 0.4, whatever. I didn't notice anything that had to do with that. Like, I thought like the resolution and stuff looked good. We didn't look at like obviously test patterns, but all of the content that we looked at, like I said, it was very hard to differentiate anything from a resolution standpoint. It looked really sharp and everything like that. Now, obviously, it's a kind of like a portable lifestyle projector, so you have to really take that, especially with the Pro 2, into account. Like we had to set it on a separate stand, and it had to be a lot closer to fill the screen because it's a lot shorter throw than a normal long throw home theater projector. It has a fixed offset for its angle. So like if you're going to mount it, it can only be in one position because of that offset angle. And then it only has so much optical zoom before you get into digital zoom, which would mean that you're screwing with the resolution of it and things like that. So again, it's, there's compromises being made. How much of those, are going to affect your enjoyment of it, I don't know. But it isn't the same. You have to take those things into consideration if you're going to, like, I could not use, well, I could, but it'd be really hard to do that projector in my room just because of like the dimensions and everything like that. So.
Yeah, that's like when I try to show it in my video when I did the C2 video yesterday. It's basically the same projector. It's just one's on a gimbal. I had to remove my entire front row just because I had to like sit it on the riser, so
Yeah.
so I didn't have to use keystoning.
Yeah.
That's a little misleading too in all these projectors. Like, just use digital keystoning. You can put it wherever you want. I was like, listen, it's a 4K projector. The second you use keystoning, it's not a 4K projector anymore.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And again, there's things with that too. Like, again, I would always say don't use Keystone. Like, obviously, like, just install the projector properly and not rely on that. But when we were talking about 4K and the pixel density of 4K, we're already pretty much past our visual acuity in almost every case, unless you're sitting really, really close to something. So the odds of having like an artifact from scaling that's now being spread over that many pixels is a lot harder to see than it was when we were dealing with like SD and HD projectors. So, yes, is it compromising the ultimate capability of the projector? Absolutely. But like so many of the things that we do that already, whether it's, using an anamorphic lens, and what does that do? Because you're going to have to, stretch the image through scaling for the compression of the lens itself. Or if you're using like a widescreen, and you're using like a video processor and you want to use the automatic aspect ratio stuff, that means it's just scaling the image within there. And more often than not, like, again, with the test pattern, are you going to notice? Sure. But like most of the content you're watching isn't at that resolution, like you're not really that close to Nyquist. There might be parts of an image that are, but the odds of you seeing any of that's pretty low. So the higher and higher resolution we get, the less likely you are to see those kind of artifacts, unless it's like doing something grossly wrong. But yeah, it is something that they need to be thinking about. But it's just 90+% of the general public,
yeah.
just wouldn't notice these things unless you pointed it out to them. So
Yeah, it's like you'll get it perfectly square at the screen, but then they got that feature. If you walk in front of it, it takes the image and moves it away from where you are.
Oh, I
From
didn't
whatever
know
the
that.
object is. Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if they do that to so that you don't hurt your eyes or something like that. Like it's a safety mechanism, maybe.
It's just
It's actually a pretty good idea for what is it? I can't remember what the level is, but like certain projectors that have a certain amount of light output, you have to have the safety areas, because if you happen to look back at it, it can mess your eyes up.
Yeah, I did that once.
The
Didn't feel
Epson
good.
should be like that if it's 10,000 lumens. So,
Yeah,
because
no,
the
there's a feature for that.
HTZ is,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's All right, last time I had you on, you haven't experienced any of the new Sony projectors yet. What do you think of these new generation
So
ones?
the only one that I've seen of the new, if you're talking about like the Bravia 8 and 9,
Yeah,
yeah, I have not seen the 8 yet. We did have the 9 at the show.
yeah,
Yeah, the Sonys always usually look great. It looks like they've improved their HDR tone mapping quite
yeah,
a bit.
yeah,
It's still not full adaptive. Like you have to like pick kind of different modes and stuff like that, but it does a much
yeah.
better job from what I saw. Outside of that, it was largely the same projector. Like, light output was similar, contrast ratio was similar. Surprisingly, it wasn't quite as accurate in terms of like color gamma and things like that out of the box as the
Mhm.
model year before, or like I've seen from Sony's in the past. And the funny thing is while I was working on that, I was like, wow, this is not nearly as accurate out of the box. I got a call from a calibrator on the West Coast that happened to work on a Sony, one of the newer ones this week, and said the exact thing. He's like, hey, did you notice that this is not nearly as accurate? And I was like, I did notice that and stuff. But I mean, we were able to get it still where
Yeah,
it was quite good and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, largely the same, but obviously now they can do 4K 120 for gaming. They have insanely low latency, so great option for somebody that's looking for gaming. Um, you know, Real bright, with the Bravia 9 and stuff like that. But yeah, through a nice image, and I'm glad to see that they're continuing to try to improve on areas that were weaker in the past and stuff like that. So
yeah. I think we had a couple of questions for you here. This is from LBMW3. Hi, gentlemen. Which screen would you recommend for the Sony Laser 2020-25? Does that make sense to you?
I think he's just saying like, the models that have come out between 2020 and
Yeah.
2025. So, the in the last few years, again, like that's a question that can't be answered with the information given.
Yeah.
As I said, there is no like best screen because the screen really has to, be suitable for whatever the projector is in the room. So I would say if you're talking about a nice light controlled home theater, that's, like more often, dark, no lights, decent reflection, and stuff like that. A 1.3 gain screen, is usually just, there's a reason that people talk about them all the time. They're usually really nice. So, Stewart Studio Tech 130, and then, like whatever anybody else is making that's along those lines. I would stay away from Lamberian, 1.0 gain screens unless again you're living in like a black velvet lined pit. They're fantastic for that, but outside of that, you're probably better off going with a 1.3 gain. If you're in a room with a lot of, like you're not controlling your light very well and a lot of reflections, then you could start looking at, some acoustically, ambient light rejecting screens like the Firehawk, for extreme cases, stuff like the Black Diamond or the Slate 1.2 from SI. It's got a little bit of a gray, to it because it's trying to do a little bit more ambient light rejection than something like a Studio Tech 130. But those are good places to start. And there's plenty of brands, like a lot of people like XY screens, EPV. I mean, you know, a lot of the difference I see, there's definitely differences in materials, but there's also material ship. So like some of them make screens that don't cost as much, and you can find some great values that still give you a great image, but you might find that their frame has a little bit of bowing to it, or like the build quality of it and stuff like that. But again, like it just depends, what your budget is and stuff like that. But there's no
Yeah.
like, hey, everybody out there, just buy this. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, try to avoid those ones with a bazillion springs that go around the frame because that will take you forever.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, those probably cost less than one that uses a snap system or something. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's what you're, but you know what I mean? That it's like anything else. There's always something, so
Hey, Chris, how good are you at disc golf? I keep seeing you in golf shirts.
I'm, I, I, I don't know, like on a scale of what? I'm not a pro, but I'm pretty good. If you know anything about disc golf, I think I'm like the last time I was rated was like 930 or something like that. So I'm a pretty good disc golfer for, just about hitting 50 years old. I can give most people a run for their money unless they're, like a local pro or whatever. But yeah, but it is definitely my focus. If I'm not doing this, I'm probably doing disc golf, and I would like to be doing disc golf a lot more than I do this. So
But I'm currently trying to figure out a good screen for an NZ7. Looking at going woven AT, 120 inch, roughly 14-foot throw, sitting 10 feet back, 100% velvet room. Any recommendations with max gain?
yeah, so for a woven, I mean that's not a really big screen, but you are only sitting about 10 feet back from it. So if you're going with a weave, you're probably like an Enlightener Neo would probably be your best bet. Like if you started looking at something like an XD, I just think that the texture of the screen, even though it's going to be a higher gain, is going to probably bother you. But like I mentioned earlier, do your research before you buy. Seymour will more than happily send you a screen material. Look at XY; they make some nice ones that are a good price point and stuff like that. They'll send you their screens as well. But with you sitting 10 feet back, I would just want to make sure that you're not going to notice either a perf or a texture of a weave. So try to get a couple different samples. I would try an ultra perf because again, like I don't know what your visual acuity is, so you
Yeah.
might find that you like that because of gain and you really don't notice the perf. But so I would say like get an ultra perf sample, get an XD sample, get an Enlightener Neo sample, and then like I said, there's some nice ones from XY screens, and some of these other ones that are out there that are pretty. What's this other one? Elite screens. I just did a calibration with an Elite screen one, and this is the Acoustic Pro UHD. So it's a weave, but it's more of like it has a gain structure, so it's probably closer to like a point 0.9, instead of like a point 0.7 and stuff like that. So, 20% difference. And, they'll send you a sample of this, just like this one here. So this is one that I just recently used for a calibration here, because I do stuff where people send me projectors and I calibrate here in my lab. So I set it, I set it to the same zoom and same throw distance. And then I put up a sample, and you can see I have it on a springboard, so it keeps it nice and tight. And then I'm measuring against the same material that they're using for the calibration. So this is one that I just recently did, but that's why I have all these samples, is so that I can offer that kind of service.
Do you have a recommended dealer that can help him with this purchase?
There's all kinds of dealers out there.
I was throwing that over to you there.
Yeah, I mean, I can help out usually with sourcing just about anything if anybody wants. The also nice thing is, obviously, I can answer pretty much any question that you could possibly think of. So, I'm going to hopefully steer you in the right direction. But, just if you're buying from anybody, like, make sure that they can answer your questions and stuff, and they're not just trying to sell you a bill of goods. It's like I said earlier, there's a lot of people that will sell you something just because, the margin that they can get from it or whatever else. You really want to try to work with somebody that's trying to get you the best possible performance for the budget that you're at. And sometimes that means selling you something that doesn't cost as much, and that should be their goal. Like I talk people out of things all the time that I would probably make more money on if I just said, yeah. So,
I mean, couldn't he just buy it from you?
He could, yes.
Okay, there you go. So a projector would be optimal for my silver ticket 135 AT screen, woven, 100% dark room. My income is limited as a retired veteran, so advised on the per model. Still looking at LS 12,000.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for your service. I'm a retired veteran as well, so thank you for that. On the cheaper models, again, like, it depends on what your budget is. That's not a really, really big screen, but it is an AT screen. So yeah, an LS 12,000, QB 1000. If those are in your budget, definitely be worth looking at. NZ 500 would still probably work okay on that, but it would be a little bit of a stretch. Valerian would work, but again, like, I don't know how sensitive you are to rainbow effect and whether or not the contrast is going to bother you. I mean, but I would probably generally want to stick to, I think a QB 1000 or an LS 12,000 both look really good on that screen. Yeah. Especially, I would also assume that that's a scope screen, which means it's actually bigger than 135 because of the way the imager is. So if it's a 135-inch scope screen, that's pretty big. So yeah, but either of those Epsons should actually work on that. So
Kris needs to come visit DFW area. We could use his expertise here.
I will be in Dallas-Fort Worth area for a calibration tour in July. Put it on your calendar. Reach out to me, deepdiveav.com or deepdiveav@gmail.com. I am going to be touring Houston. I'll probably go through Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Waco, and Dallas-Fort Worth. So if you think about it, it's like an L. I'll be doing the L in July.
Thoughts on the new desired 300 nits now for home projection instead of the old 100?
That's not really a true standard. I know that they just wrote out this, the SMPTE stuff or whatever group it was that did it. The 300 nits was based on the cinema. They did this whole cinema thing, and when you really start breaking it down, a lot of it's more marketing than anything else. But they're also saying that, like, everybody this is another thing that I always like, because there's always more to it, right? So that spec was like 300 nits, but a black floor of at least 0.05, which gives you a contrast ratio of 60,000 to 1. I don't know of any projector you're going to do 300 nits at home on a moderately big screen that's going to give you that kind of contrast ratio. Because remember, high dynamic range, not high brightness, dynamic range, right? So, and again, like, that's also based on a field of view, and we're also talking about content that is mastered specifically to 300 nits, just like Dolby Cinema, right? Everybody goes like, well, Dolby Cinema is this, so that's what I should be doing at home. Well, Dolby Cinemas have a bigger field of view, so obviously our perception of how bright that image is completely different than it is on a smaller screen. Just like it, if I go, well, my iPhone is like this, that does give me the same field of view as the monitor behind it and the stuff behind it. But yeah, so they were mastering content for that specific application, and their minimum contrast spec for that's like 60,000 to 1. So again, like if you do that with something that only has a contrast ratio of 300 or 3,000 to 1, it's very different. So again, in a dark home theater environment, I just don't really see a lot of benefit to go above certain levels. Like 125, 150 nits is probably more than you're going to need, and keep the black floor at least at a decent level with the projection system. And again, like obviously the darker the room is, the more you don't need as much light and stuff like that, and then your field of view and things like that. So there's no like just like it's this. So
I didn't know that was a thing. Guillermo became a member of the channel. Thank you, Guillermo. Guillermo also has one more question here. Currently, he has an NZ8 and a Seymour XD8T. Issue is my throw is at 14.5 feet, projecting onto 138 with a screen upgrade like Stewart Ultra Perf with 1.3 gain, if accurate, or a brighter PJ, basically trying to get brighter. Currently at 74 nits post calibration.
So if you went from a XD to a Studio Tech 130 Ultra Perf, you're looking at roughly 30% increase. So 7.5 times 3. So what are we at? Like 23 nits more. So now you would be closer to 90 something, 97 nits. So closer to like that 100. I find like most people like right around 100 nits is like kind of a sweet spot if you're in a nice dark room. So that's what changing the screen would do. Now, if you went to a different projector, it would depend on the projector and how much brighter it really is than your NZ8. So, and then, the budget of that. So like if we looked at JVC, let's say you're like, oh, I really like JVC because they're blacks, and you have an NZ8. Well, the next step up is an NZ9, and now it's the 900, and an NZ900 is almost $30,000, so it's almost twice the cost of the 800, and it's probably the difference in brightness between the two is probably close to the difference in brightness you would get between those two screens.
So I think we've got some pretty good takeaways today. First off, let your $30,000 projector warm up before deciding on if it's in focus or not. Maybe an LR screen is not the perfect choice for your dedicated theater room. And if you want to purchase anything, a calibration or a projector or some screens, you can do so from Kris at deepdiveav.com. That's deepdiveav.com.
I can certainly try to help. No, just hey, I always like being on these things. I try my best to give good information and answer questions and things like that. It's also what I do for a living. I am a calibrator, but I also offer consulting and obviously equipment sales. And if I can't source it, I will definitely point you in the direction of somebody that I think that would take care of you, in a way that I would appreciate if I was the one being taken care of. And thank you, Shane, as always, for allowing me to talk and happy to do it anytime.
Yes, man. All right, guys, thanks for checking out the video with us. If you have any questions, drop them in the comment section. If you want to reach out to Kris, I'll leave his contact information down in the video's description. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and we'll catch you again in the next video.
Thanks, everyone.